Okay, let's dig a little deeper into studying gross domestic product. You recall that gross domestic product is the total dollar amount of all final goods and services produced in a country's borders within a given year. But we haven't talked yet about how do we add those up? How do we calculate it? So there's two approaches. There's something called the income approach, where you can take everybody's income and add it all up, and then you can calculate the country's GDP. Because all of the money that people make is based upon the labor that they do making goods and services. However, the income approach is a little bit more complicated and there's a lot more steps and there's more room for error. So, economists tend to use something that's a little bit more efficient, which is called the expenditures approach. And the expenditures approach is basically taking the country's demand for goods and services and breaking into four different categories. So, what is the expenditures approach formula? So, this is a formula you have to know. You have to commit this to memory, and we can start today. So, the formula is that GDP equals C plus IG plus G plus XN. And when I first learned this, it was tough to remember these four categories too. I mean, it felt overwhelming. I mean, what is C and IG? So I'm here to kind of simplify it for you and show you that it's actually not that complicated once you understand what the four categories are. So I have four pictures here to sort of sum up the country's demand. The first picture represents the variable C, which is what we call personal consumption. And this is just a person shopping at a supermarket the way that you or I would. The second photograph is of our buddy Aaron Krause, who created Scrub Daddy. And you might recall that Aaron Krause went on Shark Tank because he was looking for money to invest in his company and build another manufacturing facility. He couldn't do that on his own, and he needed that investment. So that's a clue for the second variable, IG. The third variable shows a construction site of a highway. And this would be an example of government purchases. When the government allocates money to do things like fix roads or bridges or build a new school. The last category is XN, and the N stands for net. And net is basically when we subtract what we're spending versus what we're earning. So this is net exports. And I put a photograph of a shipping port where there's tons of containers that are coming off of ships that are either being exported from a country and going onto a ship or coming off of a ship because they're an import. So here are those four variables written down in a little easier way. So again, personal consumption is C, and that's all the stuff that households are going to do. IG is a little bit wordy, but if you can remember that the I stands for investment, then you're going to be fine. But it's gross private domestic investment. And what does that mean? Gross means total. Private means it's a privately owned business by an individual, okay, or a group of individuals. It's not owned by the government. Domestic means it's within this country, and investment means it's the money that's going into that business. The G stands for government purchases, and XN again stands for net exports. So feel free to pause the video and write those four things down and make sure you've got them by name. So let's talk about personal consumption first. Personal consumption is all of the spending that households, people like me and you, spend on goods and services. So I put images here of a supermarket, traveling on an airplane, walking around Target with a shopping cart, going to a florist, buying a car. Economists call goods by two different categories. They call them durable goods or non-durable goods. So I would say something like buying a head of lettuce or a floral bouquet. Those are a really non-durable good. They're not going to last a long time. You're going to eat the lettuce and the flowers are going to die within a couple of days. Whereas something like purchasing a car, that's going to be something that we call a durable good because it's meant to last a long time. So when people are buying a lot of durable goods, it sort of is a great signal that the economy is doing well because it implies that they feel confident that they can make a big purchase. You know, I can invest in a new car right now because I'm so confident that A, I can afford it, and B, I can pay the payments over time if that's my choice. So again, personal consumption is me and you. This is the money that we spend on things. And just a little tidbit, and this is a great little fact to write down, is that personal consumption is about 75% of the gross domestic product in the United States. So about three quarters of our GDP, give or take, year to year, is stuff that you and I buy. So consumers have tremendous amount of influence on the GDP. The next category is that IG category. And again, I know looking at those four words, gross private domestic investment, might feel a little overwhelming. But if you can just remember Scrub Daddy needing that money to build that facility, then I think you've got it. So I put some other pictures here of other types of capital goods or capital investment that businesses would make in their companies. So I did a picture of Amazon robots. That's an investment. They're going to continue to use those robots to get the product off of the shelves and into boxes for customers every single day. It's not like it's a temporary item that they're going to have today, and then once you buy something, it's gone. So it's that investment in the company that they're going to continue to use. And then also I did the tractor. So the tractor at the bottom is an interesting piece because the tractor is utilizing, let's say this one is watering these crops or even plowing. It is going to be used day after day on that farm. It's a big investment in the upfront stage, but then over time, they don't have to pay for that tractor every day. What they do have to pay for is like to upkeep that tractor. So while this year, my farm might buy that tractor, that's going to go in GDP. Next year, it's not. But the money I spend on maintaining that tractor would go into the GDP. And then I did a little picture of Starbucks here because I wanted to put a business that, you guys are probably familiar with. And even something like Starbucks buying the cups and the lids and things, those aren't part of the GDP for business investment. It's more about the machinery in the Starbucks. So take a look behind the barista. You see that there's coffee machines, and then right in front of her is probably, you see the thing on the top where they're grinding the beans, the espresso machine. That is gross private domestic investment. They're going to continue to utilize that machinery, those capital goods every single day. The cups and the lids that she's reaching for, those are something different. And we'll talk about that in a moment. Government purchases. Here's that photograph again of the construction workers working on a piece of a highway. I put a picture of a school under construction on the top right. Again, this is the money that your local, state, or federal government are spending on goods and services. This is not the money that people might be receiving because they're unemployed. This is not the money that people might be receiving because they're on food stamps or nutritional assistance. These are actual goods and services, actual businesses that the government is hiring to do work for them. So, for example, when we build a school, we have to hire an architecture firm to design the school. That is a privately owned business that now their client, instead of it being, Scrub Daddy, build me a manufacturing facility, it's, for example, the town of Barrington saying, build me a new school. On the bottom right, I put an example that might be a little bit more meaningful for you because you see that air filter on the bottom right. We have those in a lot of classrooms. Just a little fun fact to make this relevant. So, when the pandemic started, the federal government, under something called the CARES Act, allocated tons of money to states so that they could do COVID mitigation efforts in their public buildings, most importantly, schools. So, the air filters that we have in the classrooms in Barrington, the town of Barrington didn't have to pay for those. Those actually came from the federal government. So when you look at those filters, that's an example of government spending. Those are not government produced filters. Those are made by a privately owned company that the government chose to spend money on for those items. So that's government purchases. And last but not least, net exports. So I did a little math equation here. A net exports is your exports minus your imports, and it's really just the dollar amount. So I put a Ford Mustang there because Ford might export these Mustangs. They produce them here in the United States. They're an American company, and they're going to export them all over the world. Then we clearly in the United States, like most nations, import a lot from other countries. So we're going to subtract the dollars on all the things that we spend on imports from all of the dollars that we earn from our exports. And the interesting thing about this is that this number, believe it or not, can be a positive or a negative number. So if we import more than we export, then, for example, let's keep the number simple. We export $10 worth of goods and we import $20 worth of goods. Then it's going to be a minus 10. So if you go back to the original formula, C plus IG plus G plus XN, it could actually be for XN plus a negative 10. It could be a negative number. And of course, because we're dealing with the country's economy, we're dealing with really big numbers, not just $10. Okay, so that's the expenditures approach. And we're going to do some practice examples in a little bit to kind of determine, what's an example of something that would be in one of those four categories. But there's another thing that's really important, and that's there's plenty of economic activity in the country and in the world that's very, very meaningful and very important, but it is not included in the calculation of GDP. So go back to the definition of GDP, the total dollar amount of all goods and services produced within a country's borders within a given year. So you could be wearing a pair of Nike sneakers right now, but if they were manufactured in Vietnam, they're not part of our country's GDP. That doesn't mean it's all bad news, because the people who are producing those goods in the local economy that's got a Nike factory, like, there is economic activity that's happening because of those shoes in that local economy. And then those people are also purchasing goods from other nations as well. The other thing is that the Nike company, it's based in the United States. So there's plenty of Americans involved in that side of the production. And if we didn't have those shoes produced, then they wouldn't have a job. So I don't want you to think that the presence of imports is a bad news economic piece of activity. It's just that it's not made in our country. So it's logical that it wouldn't be included in the GDP. So imports are not included. I get a little bit like nitpicky with this because I feel like when you're looking at XN, you're subtracting your imports. So yes, they're ultimately not counted, but the number, the dollar amount is important for that calculation. The next thing that isn't counted are intermediate goods. Remember the photograph of the woman working at Starbucks from earlier? And I said the cups and the lids, those are important, but there's something else. That's what those are. So, intermediate goods are all the little things that a business is using that you are purchasing that they're not going to continue to use after your purchase. So, Starbucks, gross domestic private investment, the espresso machine, the cup and the lid, that's an intermediate good. They need both of those things, but they're going to be counted in GDP differently. The cup and the lid are going to be counted when we look at the, let's say, $4.25 beverage that you purchased at Starbucks. If we also counted the cup and the lid as IG, then we'd be counting them twice. So we don't count intermediate goods because it avoids double counting. The next piece here is secondhand sales. Again, we don't want to double count. We don't want the GDP to be higher than it actually is. So if you go to a yard sale and you buy a couch that somebody's selling, that's great, awesome for you. And then they don't have the clutter in their house, and then they've got some extra money and they can go use that money, and maybe they go buy lunch. Then you get the couch. Again, it's not a new good or service produced in that year. So therefore, we're not going to count the couch that you buy at a yard sale. It's great economic activity. It's important, but it's not part of this year's GDP. The underground economy. Um, the underground economy is illegal goods and services that are being produced. There are a lot of illegal goods and services, and we're not going to count those in the country's GDP if we're also going to say that those things are illegal. It would kind of be unethical to say, well, the buying of that good is illegal, but we're going to count it in the GDP because it's still economic activity. So the underground economy is actually one of those things that proves that the GDP sort of actually underestimates how much economic activity is in the country, because there's a lot of economic activity that's happening that is not legal. Stocks and bonds. You don't need to know a lot about what stocks and bonds are. Stocks are ownership in a company, and bonds are a financial investment where you can earn interest. And they're great things, but putting your money into those, you're not producing a new good or service. So if I gave you an example of, your grandparents give you a savings bond for a birthday present, or you decide to buy stock in Apple Computer. Cool, great economic things, just not part of GDP. Transfer payments. This is something that you probably have always heard about in life, but you just never called them transfer payments. So, if you've ever gotten, for example, a check from a relative for your birthday, grandma sends you a $25 check for your birthday, or somebody writes you a check because or Venmos you. Let me use that because you're probably like, my friend's not writing me a check. But let's say you go out to dinner with some friends and they say, oh, I'll put it on my credit card and you just pay me. Or, oh, I have $50, I'll just buy it and then you Venmo me. So every time you just transfer money to a friend, that's not included in our GDP. It's important economic movement of money, but it's not a new good or service. There's another type of transfer payment, and it's when money moves from the government to households. So I mentioned two of these earlier. Let's say somebody's unemployed and they're receiving an unemployment check. Or let's say somebody is unemployed and they also are now receiving nutritional assistance, something that we call food stamps. That's very important economic activity because those people now have the opportunity to spend money and to live their lives and pay their bills until they find a new job. That money that they're receiving was withdrawn from their income through the form of tax revenue when they were working. So it's not included in this year's GDP, particularly if you were going to use the income approach, because that money was already earned. Let's say, 5 years ago when I was working and then now I got unemployed, I'm going to receive unemployment insurance. And part of my unemployment compensation comes from the income that I earned years ago. Um, and that was part of the tax revenue. So transfer payments are important economic activity, but they're not a new good or service from this year. And then we also have something, this is my favorite category, and it's called non-market work. And it's all the stuff that people do that is not compensated, or it's compensated in a way that's not really official. So for instance, people who are a stay-at-home parent, they are doing the work that I pay a preschool to do for my kid. So I'm paying almost $300 a week for somebody to take care of my child. There are some parents that are doing that, quote, for free. They're doing a lot of labor and they're not being compensated by being a stay at home parent. That's non market work. Another thing is people do charity and volunteer work all the time. They're not being compensated for it. That is non market work. Sometimes we call this like under the table. So, for example, people are like, oh, does anybody want to come over on this weekend and help me move. I'll give you $50 if you help me move this weekend. And that's called non-market work. It's stuff that people are being compensated for, perhaps, or stuff that people are not being compensated for, and it's just not really official labor. And this is why measuring people's income is a really difficult approach to the calculating the GDP because, oh, can you babysit my son this afternoon? Sure, $10 an hour. Here's $30 after 3 hours. Like that is non-market work, but somebody did a new good or service. It's just not easy to track.